In the last video, we looked at basic definitions of the terms client and server. And in this video, we're going to continue with this example using the counter class. Remember that the counter class is the server class. So this is going to be used by some client. And the client's going to call query methods and command methods like increment and reset. Current count just returns the current value of count. That's a query. Okay. So how do you invoke a query? You have to have a reference to a counter object. Let's say my counter. And to query my counter for the current value of count, you just use the name of the object, the name of the variable, my counter dot current count. That's it. That's all it is. And this can be part of an expression, and it's not a statement by itself, although Java would accept it. It's usually, in this case, this query method is just going to be part of some expression. You might say my counter.current count times 2 is equal to something, or something equals, I guess I should say, something equals my current count, open close parentheses, star 2. That would take the current count, multiply it by 2, and store that value somewhere. Okay, so that's how, in this case, this query method is going to be used. So let's take a quick example. So here's a main class. This is where everything starts. It sets up a counter tester object. It's using the constructor and calls the start method. So this is the kind of thing that you'll see in the book Nino and Hosh. So hopefully you have that book handy. You'll see a lot of examples like this, starting in chapter 2 of the book. Now let's take a look at this counter tester class itself. Okay, so this counter tester class has a private data member, which is a counter. So now this is the server for counter tester. So remember that clients and servers, they're relationships between classes. So counter is the server for counter tester. Let's see what that looks like. It's very simple. It's classic counter class, just got a single data member, an int count. It's private. Data members like this should be private, remember. And then it's got a constructor which initializes count to 0. Current count is a query method, returns the value of this data member count. Increment is a command method that increments count by 1. And reset sets count to 0. So counter is the server class or server object. It's used by this counter tester. So counter tester is a client. Now it turns out in this particular case, just like in the previous example, counter tester is a client of counter, but it's also used in main. So you can say that counter tester is the server for main, and main is the client of counter tester. Hope those terms make sense. So client and server, they are relationships between pairs of classes. So if you take the pair counter and counter tester, in this case there's only one of them is a client, one of them is server. You should be clear by now that counter is the server, counter tester is the client. Now if you take a look at the relationship between the main class and counter tester is the server, main is the client, because main creates an instance of this counter tester class called tester and calls the start method, which is a command method. It might change things in counter tester. Okay, so let's go back to the notes. Hope this example makes sense. Remember that client-server relationships, those are relationships between pairs of classes. So in this case, this class counter tester is a client to counter. It's also a server to main. So it's both a client and a server. That makes sense. If not, so let me ask me in class, or send me a message. Okay. Excuse me. So you can call queries using name of the object dot query name, open close parentheses in this case. Okay, so to query the counter class, you call this, it returns the value, so you call this method, it returns, in this case, 4, and then you do something with that 4 here. Now, there's a bunch of things you can do with return values. Let me go over that in just a second. Let's take a quick look at the reset method. So the reset method, when you call that from a client, let's say my count, the client is wherever you're using it from, and you have an object, a counter object, and to call the counter object's query methods, what you do is you just name the query, open close parentheses, and then you need the semicolon, which means that's a full statement, that's a full Java statement. So query methods typically look like this. You just call the query by itself. It's not the only way to use it. It is possible for sorry, I said query. This is command. This is a command method. So this is how you call a command method. You say object name dot command name, command method name, open close parentheses, semicolon, and that's one Java statement by itself. It's not the only way you can call command methods. You could call some command methods do actually return things, and so you could use that in an expression, but this is the most simple way to call a command method. That is, call a command method, parentheses, you might pass in parameters. In this case, there's none, and then semicolon makes it a full Java statement. So what command methods do is they change the state of the client object. In this case, count starts off with the value 4. You send it the reset method, you send it the reset command, and then what reset does is change the value of count to 0. So before, the count might be 4, and after the reset method is done, the count data member goes from 4 to 0, and that's the new state of the server. Okay, so in this case, calling the command definitely did change the state of the server. So remember that the data members, the instance data members, according to the book, all of the combinations of all of the instance data members constitute the state of that object. Okay, so counter just needs one value for count. So it just has one data member or one instance variable. So those are exactly the same, mean exactly the same thing. Instance variable means data member that's an instance data member. Okay, so you just need one instance data member. In this case, it's a private int count, but in general, it'll be, of course, you want to make all your instance variables or data members private, and then you have a type like int, float, double, or maybe even string or other objects, and then the name. For us, the counter just has one data member. That's a private int count. And so now that you know that you have this data member, you want to display it in your class diagram. You use a minus to denote private, and then you use the type. Sometimes you say minus count colon int, which is what was done in some of our other handouts. This is that's actually more standard. This is not usually what's done, but this is closer to Java syntax. Okay, so here's the class counter. It has an int count. So this is an instance of the counter class is an object with the value 10 in count. Okay, so this is the class diagram. This is the object diagram. How do you tell them apart? The class diagrams have square corners, and then the object diagrams have rounded corners. So that's how you tell them apart. Once again, counter object, counter class. Okay, so how do you set up a query method? It's pretty simple. In this case, it's all it does is return the count of the value in the count data member. So a query method must deliver some value stored in this case, in the variable count, data member count. Use the return statement, and you say return something. Whatever this is has to be, we say in Java, assignment compatible with the return type. In this case, they're exactly the same. Count is an int. You're supposed to return an int. It's just fine. Now if you said count times 2.0 over here, that would not work, because count times 2.0 would be promoted to a double. That double, you cannot return a double if you have an int return type. Okay, so in this case, nice and simple. Count is an int, you return an int, everything just works. In general, you can have any kind of expression. So for example, take the value of count times 2.0. That would be an expression. So in Java, you can have all kinds of things in an expression. So what is in Java? It's a language construct that describes how to compute a particular value. When you're returning an int, when you're returning just a simple type, all you're doing is returning the value in that type. So for example, let's just go back. When you're returning count, what are you doing? You're just taking the value of count, returning that value. It could be more complicated, like count times 2.0. So the CPU, the processor, evaluates the expression to produce a value, and then that value is returned. Whatever value you produce has to be compatible with the return type. Okay, so how do you implement simple commands? Usually what you do is you modify the state of an object, and so use assignment statements. That's the most common thing. You can also do things like, let's say, count plus plus. That is equivalent to saying count is equal to count plus 1. So essentially it's using an assignment statement, although it's not obvious. The most common way of implementing simple commands would be to use assignment statements, usually one or more. So an assignment statement just says something is assigned the value of the right-hand side. So this right-hand side can be an expression. So for example, count is equal to count plus 1. Count plus 1 is an expression. The right-hand side is always a single value. The left-hand side is always the name of the place where you're going to store it. So more generally than in Java, the left-hand side is always some memory location where you're going to store something. The right-hand side is some value. And you can do something like count is equal to 0, right? That 0 is an expression. You can say count is equal to count plus 1. That count plus 1 is an expression. So you can have all kinds of things in here, but it has to evaluate to some finite value. So what the CPU does is it computes the value by looking at the expression, by analyzing this expression, figuring out what it needs to do, creates or generates a value, and then stores that value in some memory location, or in Java we call it a variable, on the left-hand side. So whatever was here before is gone. You're storing some new value into that variable name. So I'm going through it in a lot of detail. I'm sure you've seen all of this. So I'm hoping that you've seen all of this in earlier classes. But an assignment statement, you might think, is probably one of the simplest things that you can have. You're saying x is equal to 1, or x is equal to 2, or x is equal to x plus 1. That's a little bit more complicated, but you guys have seen it. However, now it turns out that this is a very good thing to remember when you're debugging. The left-hand side is always the place where you're storing something. The right-hand side is always a value. So it's a very good thing to remember. I know you've been programming for maybe a year, but it's always something that you want to watch out for when you're debugging. It might help you. Okay, so how do you set up this reset command? All we want to do is store the value 0 in the variable count. You just assign the value 0 to count. Simple. In this case. For the command method increment count, you do something a little bit more complicated. We want to take whatever count value we currently have, add 1 to it, and then store it. So we have to use count on the left-hand side, so you have to say count is equal to something. On the right-hand side, we use the expression count plus 1. You might think that you could do count is equal to count plus plus. Now that's something that on the surface looks like it should work, but it doesn't. So doing count is equal to count plus plus does not work. And if you want to figure out why, you try it or ask me in class.